Alexander Whitmore had everything money could buy. At 42, he was the CEO of one of the world's largest technology companies, with an estimated fortune of $8 billion. His Beverly Hills mansion had 23 bedrooms, a wine cellar with wines that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime, and garages filled with cars that were true works of art on wheels. He was married to Victoria, a socialite who appeared on the covers of the most important magazines, always impeccably groomed, always smiling that perfect smile that hid a profound emptiness. They had 2 children, educated at the best private schools in California, children who barely knew their own father because he was always too busy building his empire. Alexander lived in a world of boardroom meetings, gala dinners, and charity events where the rich pretended to care about the poor while drinking $1,000 champagne. But behind all that ostentation, Alexander was dying inside. Each day felt like a mechanical repetition of the previous one, an endless cycle of empty obligations and superficial conversations. He would wake up in his king-size bed, which felt more like an ice field than a place of intimacy with his wife, have breakfast prepared by a private chef he barely looked in the eye, climb into his Rolls-Royce and head to an office at the top of a skyscraper where he made decisions that affected thousands of lives, but didn't touch his own heart in the slightest. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday in November. Alexander was returning from yet another frustrating meeting where they discussed numbers, stocks, and market strategies that seemed so far removed from human reality that he felt a sick feeling welling up in his stomach. His driver dropped him off in front of an expensive restaurant where he was having a business dinner, but something in him snapped at that moment. He dismissed the driver, said he would return by taxi, and began walking the streets of Los Angeles, something he hadn't done in years. The rain was pouring down, soaking his $5,000 suit, but he didn't care. He walked for blocks, passing the brightly lit windows of luxury stores, until he reached a part of the city he normally avoided, where the lights were dim and the sidewalks were crowded with people forgotten by society. It was there, beneath the old awning of an abandoned building, that he saw her for the first time. She was sitting on the floor, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. Her eyes closed and her face turned upward, letting the rain dripping from the ceiling fall on her skin. There was something about her that made Alexander pause. It wasn't pity. It wasn't morbid curiosity. It was something different, something he couldn't quite name. It was as if she emanated a peace he'd never felt before, even with all her wealth. She opened her eyes and looked directly at him. And in that moment, Alexander felt as if he were being seen for the first time in his life. Truly seen, not as the billionaire, not as the CEO, but as a lost and alone human being. Her name was Elena. She was 34, but life on the streets had aged her in ways that went beyond her physical appearance. Elena wasn't born on the streets. She had a story, a life before everything fell apart. She grew up in a middle-class family in San Diego, studied literature at university on a scholarship because her family couldn't afford it, and dreamed of being a writer. She worked at a small publishing house, lived in a modest apartment with her then boyfriend, and had simple but meaningful plans for the future. But life has a cruel way of destroying our plans. Her boyfriend left her out of the blue, taking all their savings. That same week, the publishing house where she worked went bankrupt. Elena tried to get back on her feet, looking for a job, but the economic crisis was brutal, and doors closed one after another. She couldn't pay her rent, was evicted, and with no family to fall back on, because her parents had died in a car accident years before and she was an only child. Elena found herself on the streets. At first, she believed it was temporary, that she would soon find a job and get out of her situation. But weeks turned into months, months turned into years, and she realized that society had a way of rendering people invisible. No one looked at her when she asked for help. No one cared about her story. She was just one of thousands of forgotten people. Alexander couldn't get Elena out of his head that night. He returned to his mansion, took a hot bath, ate dinner alone in the enormous dining room because Victoria was at a charity event and the children were with their nannies, and stayed up late thinking about those eyes that had truly seen him. In the following days, he returned to that same place. He brought food, blankets, and began talking to Elena. At first, she was suspicious, accustomed to people who gave to charity to feel better about themselves, people who took photos to post on social media showing how kind they were. But deep down, they didn't really care. But Alexander was different. He didn't take photos. He didn't talk about himself. He simply listened. And Elena, who had no one to talk to for so long, began to open up. She told him about her life before the streets, about her dreams of writing, about the poems she still composed in her mind even though she had nowhere to write them down. Alexander would sit for hours, there on the cold floor beside her, listening to her stories, and for the first time in years, he felt alive. He felt connected to something real, something that had substance and truth, unlike everything in his luxurious life that felt like it was made of cardboard. The weeks passed, and those meetings became the most important part of Alexander's day. He began making excuses to leave the office early, to cancel social engagements, just so he could be with Elena. He brought her books, notebooks so she could get back to writing. And little by little, he discovered he was falling in love. It wasn't a superficial passion based on appearances or social status. It was something profound, born from the recognition of two souls equally lost in different worlds. Elena, too, began to feel something for him. At first, she fought these feelings because she knew they came from completely opposite universes. She lived on the streets while he lived in a palace. But the heart doesn't understand logic. She saw in him not the billionaire, but the broken man desperately searching for something real. One night, under a rare starry sky in Los Angeles, Alexander held Elena's hand and confessed that he could no longer live his life of lies. He said that each day with her was more valuable than all the years he had lived in her world of luxury and falsehood. The news that Alexander Whitmore was spending time with a homeless woman spread like wildfire. First, it was the security guards who discreetly followed him and reported it to Victoria. Then it was the paparazzi who got photos of one of the richest men in the world sitting on the ground of a dirty street talking to a homeless woman. The headlines were merciless and sensational. The media painted Elena as an opportunist who was manipulating a wealthy, perhaps mentally unstable man. Victoria was furious, not so much about the possible betrayal, as their long-standing marriage had been nothing more than a facade, but about the public humiliation. The company's board was in a panic as the stock began to plummet in the wake of the backlash. Alexander's friends, if they could be called that, turned their backs on him. Everyone demanded that he stop this madness, seek psychological help, and come to his senses. But the more they pressed, the more Alexander became certain that this was the only true path he had found in life. The pressure culminated in a brutal meeting at the family law firm. Victoria was there, with her lawyers, her parents, and the company executives, all united against Alexander. They presented an ultimatum. Either he cut off all contact with Elena, enter a rehabilitation program they had already arranged, and return to being the perfect CEO his public image demanded, or he would lose everything. Victoria threatened a divorce that would leave him without his children. The board threatened his removal from the company, and his in-laws threatened to expose him publicly in even more damaging ways. Alexander looked at all the faces around the polished mahogany table, people who supposedly cared about him, and saw only empty masks preoccupied with money, power, and appearances. He calmly stood up, straightened his tie, and said something that shocked everyone present. He said he was resigning as CEO, that he would accept the divorce on whatever terms Victoria wanted, that he was giving up everything, the mansion, the cars, the bank accounts, everything he had built, because he had found something that no amount of money could buy. The reaction was one of utter disbelief. Victoria screamed that he was crazy, that he was throwing away everything they had worked for, but Alexander knew he was the one who had worked, while she was only spending. The executives tried to argue that he was committing professional suicide, that he would regret it, but Alexander had never felt so certain of anything in his life. He signed every paper they put in front of him, documents that stripped him of his fortune, his company, his life of luxury. The only thing he negotiated was a modest sum of money, a few million, which he insisted on putting into a trust to ensure his children's education and future, because even though he was leaving that life, He would not completely abandon his responsibilities as a father. In the following months, legal battles unfolded, the media went into a frenzy over the story, and Alexander became simultaneously a romantic hero to some and an irresponsible madman to others. But he didn't care about opinions. For the first time, he was making decisions based on what his heart truly wanted, not what society expected of him. Alexander went to live with Elena. Not on the streets, per se, because with the money he had saved, he rented a small apartment in a simple neighborhood, the kind of place he had never set foot in before, with thin walls where he could hear the neighbors, no doorman, no luxuries, but which felt like a palace to him, because it was shared with someone he truly loved. Elena was frightened by it all. She couldn't believe someone had actually given up a lifetime of wealth for her. She felt guilty, thinking she had ruined his life. But Alexander always reassured her that she had saved his life, not destroyed it. He said he had lived for 42 years as a wealthy ghost, and now, for the first time, he was truly living. The first few months were an adjustment. Alexander, who had never cooked a meal in his life, learned to make pasta and scrambled eggs. He who had people to do everything, learned to do laundry, clean the house, and manage electricity and water bills. Every mundane task was a discovery, and surprisingly, he found joy in these simple things. Elena, meanwhile, was experiencing a rebirth. She began writing seriously again, filling notebooks with poetry and stories, and Alexander constantly encouraged her. He landed a modest job at a small tech startup, where he was just another programmer, not the boss, and discovered he enjoyed working with his hands on code, creating something without the pressure of shareholders and profits. But the world doesn't easily forgive those who defy its rules. Alexander and Elena's lives were constantly harassed. Paparazzi followed them, trying to capture any moment of supposed regret or failure. Alexander's family made numerous attempts to bring him back, sending psychologists, offering deals, even suggesting that if he returned, they would allow Elena to live comfortably somewhere discreet, as if she were a mistress who could be hidden. Alexander refused everything. Victoria used her children as a weapon, making visits difficult, telling the children that their father had abandoned them for a stranger. This broke Alexander's heart, and there were nights when Elena found him crying, questioning if he had made the right choice. She offered several times to leave, to free him from that burden, but he always held her hands and said there was no greater freedom than being with her. Financial challenges also arose. Alexander, accustomed to never thinking about money because he always had too much, now had to calculate every expense, deciding between paying the electricity bill or buying better food. There was indignity in that at times, but there was also a strange satisfaction in knowing that everything they had was earned through honest labor. The turning point came almost 2 years after Alexander left his billionaire life. Elena had written a book, a collection of poems and short stories about her life on the streets, about finding love in the most unlikely circumstances, about the hypocrisy of a society that values money above humanity. Alexander encouraged her to try to publish, but publisher after publisher rejected the manuscript. They said it was well written but lacked commercial appeal, that the public wouldn't be interested in the perspective of a formerly homeless woman. This devastated Elena, who began to believe her words were worthless. Alexander, however, had an idea. He still had some contacts in the tech world, people who respected him for his skills, not his money. He worked nights and weekends and created a simple online platform where Elena could publish her poetry for free. They promoted it through social media, sharing their story, and something magical happened. People started reading it. Not millions at first, but hundreds, then thousands. Elena's writing touched hearts because it was genuine, because it came from a place of real pain and genuine resilience. Heartfelt comments began to pour in, with people saying that Elena's words made them see the humanity in the homeless people they passed every day, that they changed their perspective on what truly matters in life. Alexander and Elena's story began to be seen in a new light. More serious journalists began covering it not as a scandal, but as a fascinating study of values and choices. Documentary filmmakers became interested, wanting to tell the full story, not the sensationalized version. An independent producer offered to make a documentary about their lives, and they accepted on the condition that part of the proceeds would go to organizations that help homeless people. The documentary premiered at a film festival and won awards. Suddenly, Elena was no longer seen as the opportunist who seduced a billionaire, but as a talented writer who survived the unimaginable. Alexander was no longer the madman who threw everything away, but the courageous man who questioned the values of a society obsessed with material wealth. Elena's book, which had been rejected by every publisher, was finally published by an independent publisher and became a phenomenon. It made the bestseller list not because it was promoted by celebrities or big marketing campaigns, but because people recommended it to each other, because the words resonated with something deep in the human soul. Success brought money back into their lives, but in a completely different way. This time it wasn't inherited money or money earned through corporate exploitation. It was money earned through art and truth. Elena began lecturing at universities, speaking about social inequality, about not judging people by their appearance, about how society fails its most vulnerable members. Alexander accompanied her, and together, they created a foundation that offered not only food and shelter to homeless people, but real opportunities for a fresh start with programs in education, mental health, and reintegration into the workforce. They used their unexpected fame for real causes, refusing interviews on sensationalist programs and choosing only platforms that allowed serious discussions about social issues. The fortune Elena earned from her book was modest compared to the billions Alexander had previously earned, but for them, it was more than enough. They bought a simple but comfortable house with a garden where Elena liked to write in the mornings and where Alexander planted a vegetable garden because he discovered he enjoyed working with the land. The sweetest revenge wasn't planned, but it happened naturally. Victoria, who had gotten most of Alexander's fortune in the divorce, discovered that money without purpose is utterly empty. She continued her socialite life, but people began to see her differently. When she spoke ill of Alexander at events, people exchanged uncomfortable glances. The narrative had shifted, and now she was seen as the cold woman who couldn't see what truly mattered. Her children, as they grew older and had access to information unfiltered by their mother, began seeking contact with their father. The eldest, at 16, appeared at Alexander and Elena's doorstep, tears in his eyes, saying he had read Elena's book and seen the documentary, and that he wanted to know the real father, not the caricature his mother painted. That was one of the happiest days of Alexander's life. He hugged his son and cried, and Elena, with her characteristic generosity, welcomed the boy as her own. The youngest daughter followed a few months later, and little by little Alexander rebuilt his relationship with his children, this time based on honesty and real presence, not expensive gifts and empty promises. The company Alexander had founded and left ironically suffered. Without his vision and leadership, poor decisions were made, financial scandals emerged, and the billion-dollar company began to lose value. The same executives who had pressured him to stay were eventually fired or resigned in disgrace. The board that had ousted him was replaced, and in a twist no one expected, the company's new leadership approached Alexander, asking him to return as a consultant, not as CEO, but as someone who could help the company find its soul again. Alexander accepted on his terms. He would work remotely, a few hours a week, and a large portion of his compensation would be in the form of direct company donations to social causes. He didn't want to become a billionaire again, but he was willing to use his knowledge to ensure the company at least attempted to operate more ethically. It was a way to demonstrate that it was possible to exist in the business world without completely losing one's humanity, though he acknowledged it was a constant battle. Elena published 3 more books in the following years, each exploring different aspects of the human experience: inequality, love, loss, hope. She became an important voice in contemporary literature, not because she had a sensationalized story with a billionaire, but because she had genuine talent and something important to say. Literary critics who had initially ignored her began to recognize the depth of her work. She won literary awards and was invited to international festivals, But whenever she traveled, she kept her feet on the ground. She visited homeless shelters in the cities she visited, talked to people, listened to their stories, and these conversations fueled her writing. Alexander accompanied her whenever he could, and they became a couple admired not for their glamour, but for their authenticity. In interviews, when Elena was asked if she felt like Cinderella, if she had fulfilled a dream of escaping poverty to live with a prince, she always corrected, it wasn't Alexander who saved her. They saved each other, because they were both lost in different types of poverty. She materially, and he spiritually. The challenges didn't disappear completely. There were moments of doubt, arguments about money, about children, about how to balance the public life they had unintentionally created with the desire for privacy. Elena dealt with trauma from her years on the streets that didn't disappear simply because she now had a roof over her head. She had nightmares, anxiety, and needed therapy to process it all. Alexander struggled with guilt related to his children, constantly questioning whether he had been selfish in his choices, whether he had the right to destroy their stability even if that stability was a comfortable lie. They fought sometimes, like any couple, but the difference was that they had built their relationship on brutal honesty, so they worked through the problems instead of sweeping them under the rug as Alexander had done in his previous marriage. Elena taught Alexander that vulnerability isn't weakness, that it's okay not to have all the answers, that sometimes just being present is enough. Alexander taught Elena that she deserved love and stability, that her worth wasn't tied to her financial situation, that she was brilliant and talented and deserving of all the good things that were happening. 5 years after Alexander left his mansion to live with Elena, they married. It was a simple ceremony on a public beach. No fanfare, no VIP guest list, just true friends they'd made along the way, including several people they'd met on the streets, who were now recovering with the help of the foundation they'd created. Alexander's children were there, and his youngest daughter was the maid of honor. There were no photographers hired, but someone filmed it on a cell phone, and the video eventually circulated online, not because they promoted it, but because people shared it, moved by the simplicity and genuineness of the celebration. Victoria wasn't invited, of course, but surprisingly, she sent a letter a few days before the wedding. The letter, she didn't exactly apologize, but she acknowledged that she might not have understood what Alexander was looking for, and that she hoped he had found the happiness he sought. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot to Alexander, because it showed that even the most difficult people are capable of some reflection and growth. Alexander and Elena's story became a powerful example that love transcends social barriers, and that happiness can't be bought. They constantly received messages from people saying that their story had changed perspectives, that it had made someone reconsider what they truly value in life, that it had inspired someone to volunteer or simply treat homeless people with more dignity and respect. They didn't intend to become icons or symbols. They simply wanted to live their lives, but they recognized that they had a platform and a responsibility. So they used their voices to amplify the voices of others who didn't have the same opportunities. Elena always made a point of saying in interviews that she was just one of millions of homeless people, that she had lucked into an unlikely encounter, but that so many others with equally valuable stories died on the streets, ignored and forgotten. She used her fame to humanize an entire population that society preferred to keep hidden. Alexander never regretted his decision. Yes, there were times when a little extra comfort would have been nice, when the old car broke down or when bills piled up, but these were minor inconveniences compared to the existential emptiness he felt as a billionaire. He had learned that there was a huge difference between living and simply being alive. For years, he had been a dead man walking, going through the motions, accumulating wealth that brought no satisfaction, surrounded by people who didn't truly know him. Now, he woke every morning next to someone who loved him for who he was, not for what he possessed. He had purpose, genuine connection, meaning. His children visited him regularly, and the relationships he built with them were now deep and real. They talked about important things, about values, about challenges, about dreams. His eldest son had decided to study social work, inspired by the foundation's work, and Alexander couldn't be prouder. His youngest daughter had also begun writing, encouraged by Elena, and showed impressive talent. The foundation they created grew and began to make a real difference. They didn't just provide basic necessities, but created holistic programs that treated homeless people as complex human beings with complex needs. They had mental health programs because they recognized that many people on the streets were there because of trauma and untreated illnesses. They had job training programs teaching practical skills and helping with job placement. They had transitional housing where people could stay while they re-established themselves without the judgment and overly restrictive rules of many traditional shelters. Most importantly, they treated everyone with dignity and respect. Elena insisted on this because she remembered what it was like to be invisible, what it was like to be treated like human waste by people rushing past. Every person who entered the foundation was greeted with a smile, their name asked and remembered, and the assurance that their story mattered. The success rate was impressive, with over 60% of the people who went through their program successfully leaving the streets permanently, a rate far higher than the national average. The impact of their story was beyond their wildest imagination. Similar cases began to surface, with people from around the world making radical choices based on love rather than social convenience. A doctor in India left his lucrative private practice to work in favelas after reading Elena's book. A lawyer in Brazil left a prestigious firm to defend homeless people for free, citing Alexander and Elena as inspiration. University professors began using Elena's book in sociology, literature, and ethics courses. Online discussion groups formed to debate the themes raised by their story: what truly constitutes wealth, how society defines value, whether it's possible to be happy with less, whether love can truly overcome class differences. These weren't magical solutions or perfect happy endings, but they were important conversations that needed to happen. Alexander and Elena didn't have all the answers, but they had asked important questions through their choices and their lives. 10 years after that rainy night when they first met, Alexander and Elena sat together in the small garden of their home, watching the sunset. Elena was working on her 5th book, this time a fiction inspired by all the people she had met over the years. Alexander had just returned from a meeting with the Foundation's board, where they discussed plans to expand into more cities. His children were visiting for the weekend. Life wasn't perfect. It never is. But it was real, and it was theirs. Alexander took Elena's hand, the same hand he had held for the first time years ago beneath an old awning, and she looked at him with those eyes that had truly seen him from the first moment. They didn't need to say anything because some things go beyond words. They had proven that love knows no social boundaries, that happiness isn't found in bank accounts, that courage sometimes means destroying everything you've built to rebuild something real. They had paid a high price for their choices, faced judgment, lost people, fought countless adversities, but they had gained something infinitely more valuable. They had found each other, and in the process, they had found themselves. And in the end, it wasn't about a billionaire who abandoned everything or a homeless woman who found salvation. It was about 2 human beings who had the courage to choose love and authenticity in a world that constantly pushes people toward conformity and superficiality. Their story would continue to resonate, not as an impossible fairy tale, but as a reminder that there are always choices. There is always the possibility of change. There is always hope that we can be more than what society expects us to be. Touched your heart. If you believe that true love can overcome any barrier, if you also seek stories that make you feel, reflect, and believe that happiness lies in the choices we make, not in what we possess, then you're in the right place. This channel is dedicated to bringing real and moving stories about people who dared to defy expectations, who chose their hearts over convenience, who proved that love is stronger than any prejudice or social inequality. Here you'll find stories of overcoming adversity, of courage, of ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. Stories that will make you cry, smile, and above all, believe that a better world is possible when we place humanity above all else. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any stories that can change your perspective on what truly matters in life. Share this video with someone who needs to believe in true love. Comment below what you would do if you were in Alexander's shoes. If you would have the courage to abandon everything for love. And leave a like if you believe that genuine relationships are worth more than all the money in the world. Together, we can share stories that inspire, that move, that remind us of the beauty that exists when two souls find each other against all odds. This channel is for those who believe in second chances, in new beginnings, in happy endings that are achieved with sweat, tears, and a lot of courage. Be part of this incredible community that values stories with substance, that touch on real issues like social inequality, prejudice, struggle, and overcoming. Because in the end, we all seek the same thing: true connection, authentic love, and the courage to live according to our values, not the expectations of others. Subscribe now and be part of this exciting journey through stories that prove that love always wins, that kindness exists, and that it's never too late to start over and seek true happiness, no matter how impossible the path seems.